Hi everyone, I'm Kitsune.
And I'm Vee.
And joining us this week, Kaito Cunningham from Utopia Labs.
We talk about a lot of interesting subjects.
From imagining what product is going to replace yours further down the line,
to the evolution of projects in the crypto space.
And then to the age-old question, what would happen if a DAO bought a fighter jet and a nuclear weapon?
Or a country.
As always, if you like the show, please like, subscribe, and leave us a review.
And as always, feel free to reach out if you have a story you want to share with us.
And now, here's Kaito.
This is an ASMR podcast.
Yeah, just getting really, just doing mouth noises really close to the mic. Yeah, I did the most spat all over my microphone. Yeah, just like clicking fingernails and like refilling pens.
So this just goes to show how laid back we are. We're very
yeah, and we always say this, like, you know, like the point of the show is not really like anything to do with, you know, alpha or anything super technical or you know, really in any way, you know, those super like niche topics. It's much more NPR style, just wanting to like hear stories. Although we were discussing this before we recorded, you know, one of our standard questions we don't really get to do this time, which is like, where does your Anon name come from? And you just don't have one. We're kind of on a hot streak with those recently.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, I listened to your recent podcast. I think it was the most recent episode with Sammy. So know y'all got some really dope people on. But yeah, I might be the first doxed individual, potentially.
I think it's you and Lawrence. You know, I guess in absence of the question, like, you know, where is this Anon name came from? Like, Kaito, why did you decide to like rock doxed? You know, like what, you know, was it like a conscious decision? Was it, you know, from the beginning? Did you transition into it? Like, what was the mindset behind being like, I'm actually just going to put myself out there?
Yeah, that's actually, I didn't even like, when I came into crypto, I didn't kind of think of it I didn't think of it as like two options, which I just came in docs, and that was like kind of like the mentality I came in with. I think specifically maybe the way that we're building our company or the way that we work with and kind of interface with a lot of our customers, I think there's a degree of confidence to an extent that I might be, you know, docs to an extent, but I don't think that's really even like an argument really. Honestly, I don't really have a specific reason of why I specifically came in doxed. Some of our team talk about it sometimes of saying, hey, you know, if we could go back, would you do it? And you know, it's kind of like an on and off thing. But yeah, no, I didn't actually put too much thought into it, to be frank. It wasn't like a strategic decision at all. You know, I always found that regardless of the other smaller companies that I always tried starting, I was kind of doxed in that sense too. So, you know, they were all outside of crypto, but that's kind of the mentality I came in with. There wasn't too much strategy behind that thought process.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, you know, there are people with all multitudes of reasons like for and against. Like, you know, mine are pretty much like I have a previous life that it was very visible online, and like I was like I kind of want to make them separate, and I have a corporate job, but you know, I feel like a lot of people I've been seeing kind of like, you know, I'll face docs, I'll do whatever, which I think is like a sign of the industry maturing, right? Like it's a sign of like, okay, we're no longer, you know, all just anime PFPs running around completely anonymous. But yeah, I get, you know, I guess to that point of trust, like anytime it's kind of funny to say in crypto, but like if you're handling, part of people's livelihood, specifically like something like, the ability to be paid, I think
Hmm.
people would probably feel much more comfortable being like, this isn't, Pepe Avatar 718, who's in charge of all of it.
Yeah, no, I feel that too. But then, I also trust a ton of the in on people too. So I think trust is kind of an interesting word to think about because like I think trust is regardless of the background that you come from or whether you're doxed or anonymous, like I still have the same level of trust for a lot of these folks and whatever that looks like. So I think that's an interesting thing. But that was just like kind of like the immediate opinion that came into to just building this and then thinking that could be the route. But I'm always open to kind of being challenged there as well. But yeah, that's kind of how it came into it. And I think all my other co-founders are doxed as well. We just came in as kind of like college students or just fresh grads that wanted to just build stuff, right? So we didn't really think of the implications of that. We just wanted to start building, and yeah, I still have like a LinkedIn profile and a Twitter profile and everything with the with my profile picture and everything. So that's kind of how it's at.
I mean, that's actually kind of like, a good transition. Like, as much as you'd like to share, like, what was your trajectory or path to getting here? Like, how did you first enter the crypto space? Like, what was your origin story?
Yeah, yeah. That for me, like I fell in love with crypto and I came into this space about 2 years ago. So I'm a pretty kind of fresh bloomer in that sense. My quick kind of life story is that I was in college and actually this is almost like a 1 year anniversary of when I exactly dropped out actually. But uh,
Congratulations. That is we're
thank you,
that is
thank you,
like
I
an
guess.
auspicious moment, and I appreciate you celebrating it with us.
No, no, I guess. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. But no, yeah, so throughout my college years, I was always just building stuff. I kind of loved the idea of like, hey, I have an idea. Hey, I could build it. And just kind of that kind of 0 to 1 nature was something that I found to be really cool. So I discovered what even the term entrepreneurship meant in like the late year of my first year. Started building a bunch of projects. This was outside of crypto again. So I was building stuff like in e-commerce to ed tech to re-commerce, which is like secondhand marketplaces and stuff like that. So it was just all over the place, and I was just trying to discover what I was trying to do. And then throughout that period of while I was building side projects, I also was kind of going down more this corporate business like route. So I was actually on path to becoming an accountant. So I interned at Ernst and Young. Learned a lot about accounting and taxes and all those types of things. And from there, was just figuring myself out. But about 2 years ago, so I'm a late bloomer as well in regards to this idea of dropping out of college. I dropped out in my senior year. So I only had a few semesters left, but I actually met my co-founders on Discord and Twitter. So it's kind of interesting. Like I wouldn't consider, Utopia a DAO at all, but I did meet my co-founders, Price, Alex, and Jason, all on Twitter and Discord. We met, we started shipping products together and we found that we worked really, really well together. But before that, I'm kind of going all over the place, but I really loved crypto. Specifically, I fell in love with this idea of the identity stack. I'm Canadian actually. So this idea of credit scores were things that are really interesting. And I'm like, yo, I'm Canadian. If I ever come down to the Bay or if I ever get my visa, I don't really have any kind of collateral to show
Sure.
my credit score. And I'm like, hey, well, like, what is the solution to this? Like, is there some sort of global universal credit score like identity? And I thought that was actually going to be my next idea and my next project that I was going to build after like my 3 failed projects. And then I, throughout that time while I was researching, that's when I discovered the crypto space. I'm like, hey, crypto is probably the infrastructure and the technology that could probably support this opinion and this idea. But I never went through with the idea. And then I started digging in, researching, met my co-founders on Discord and Twitter. We started shipping products together, and then came across Utopia, and it's just been heads down ever since. And it's almost a year since we started Utopia. We actually kind of went public and live in September last year as well. So we're about 10 months old, 9 months old. I can't do math right now, but that's kind of the quick life story there.
I guess we talk to a lot of people who are either like newer entrants to the space or like who have been around like for a long time and have seen a lot of cycles. And I feel like a lot of those people really run kind of a spectrum of like how centralized or like how compliant they want to be. And I guess like where would you land on it, right? Like the idea of like payroll is essentially like a subset of something like business banking, right?
Yep. Yep.
And the idea of like identity as a score is, an evolution off of, something that, I think a lot of people don't like, which are credit scores. Like, so where would
Hmm.
you say you kind of land on that spectrum? Like, there's a lot of people that we've talked to who have been like, if more and more things become controlled or centralized, then we'll just go keep building deeper and deeper and farther away. And then there are other people who are like, I fully welcome the, you know, entrance of traditional finance and traditional business. So I kind of, where do you fall on that spectrum, if that's not like too broad of a question?
No, I don't think it's too broad. And I'd love to hear what y'all think on this too, because I think these are things that we're thinking about. But it's almost like I don't have an extremely opinionated stance here. I think, like, kind of, let me know if this kind of answers your question or even kind of like builds on top of it. But um, there's this interesting idea of like, hey, there's credit scores and TradFi. There's individuals that are literally ranked differently accordingly to kind of the way they operate in terms of their financial. Um, Activity, right? And when you think of it like that, like should that be in crypto? Like that's a question that we should ask ourselves right away, which is like, should Kitsune and should V have a better credit score on chain than Kaito? What does that mean for the rest of people across the world who might not have been able to take advantage of getting an earlier credit score or a better credit score than other people on chain? So I think a lot of the things that we're thinking about in regards to these traditional TradFi concepts, whether it is payroll and credit scores, um, I think they can be done differently. That's the one thing. And I think there's different and better ways of implementing these systems. And I don't have the answers to all of these types of like business banking products or whether it's things like credit scores, but I truly believe that crypto in of itself could provide that technology to provide better systems. Specifically with like payroll, right? Like I think for us, we've seen it, but if you use a traditional payroll product, right, when you execute a payment, it might take 3 to 5 days because the ACH transfers. And I'm sure we all know this. That's one of the basic primitives of blockchains, which is pretty much not instant finality, but compared to banking products and compared to the traditional rails, relatively instant finality, right? So it's obviously a 10x experience. So I think there's a lot of interesting things when you think about these things like credit scores. Like, should we actually think about that? Another quick thought that I had was like, if we have like these bounty like products that accumulate credentials on chain, what does that mean for the rest of society when in an optimal kind of experience, right? There's in 5, 10 years, there's going to be a bunch of people using crypto. The entire world ideally onboards onto crypto. And what does it mean for the people who've been able to onboard with a ton of NFT like credentials 5 years earlier before the rest of society? Like those are some of the things that are really, really interesting to think about. I sadly don't have an answer to things like credit scores or bounties, but those are some of the running thoughts that I also have. I'd love to hear if y'all have any thoughts, but that's kind of the running trail there.
I was gonna say it's certainly wild and a lot to think about. You mentioned that you're Canadian, and so if you were to come down to the U.S. not having that type of credit history to kind of build upon, and I just keep thinking about how many people in the U.S. don't even fully understand the credit score system, or how many people aren't even
Yeah,
aware that they like a credit score exists, and so building that type of infrastructure, for lack of a better word, on a global scale is definitely. I feel like to some extent we already have that in terms of different applications or dApps that utilize rely on chain activity for evaluating like for airdrops and stuff. Different
yeah,
usage across different chains and platforms. So I certainly think it's a worthwhile idea to explore for sure.
totally, totally. Because at the end of the day, credit is a bit more capital efficient than and like to an extent. Please feel free to challenge me here because I'm sure y'all are deeper in the DeFi space than I am. But to an extent, credit is basically a method of working capital efficiency, potentially through things like under collateralization, right? If there's no idea of credit, then over collateralization is a requirement. So it's an interesting thing to think about because credit unlocks efficiency, but does credit somehow in some way unlock only 5% of the people who actually interact with crypto or use crypto or advantageous to this specific group? And I think they're just healthy questions to ask.
And especially with the recent centralized entities kind of blowing up regarding
Totally. Yeah.
the uncollateralized loans are, that's ridiculous. But
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes down to credit, like as a pretty firm enemy of the credit system, personally, I think like what it maybe like the analog or like the evolution is like something trust based, because I mean in one way that's what credit, the credit score system, you could say, started out as, is like the ability to ascertain whether this individual is capable or willing or has a history of paying back loans, right? Or taking on that risk, which has now, of course, evolved into like a way to, disenfranchise people and keep the classes in relatively static strata. But like, on chain, I mean, the mechanism there seems much more valuable in terms of like mitigating a counterparty risk. Like, am I working with somebody who has, demonstrably like rugged in the past, or who has shilled and dumped on their followers or whatever, and I think that's obviously much harder because of the ease of spinning up like wallet addresses and digital identity. But I certainly think that there's like a place, right, for some trust based word, credit worthiness, if you will, on crypto in a way that's inclusive rather than exclusive, and in a way that's like protecting rather than gating people out. Like, I guess to your point, like very reasonably speaking, the three of us would have good scores, but like, yeah, if somebody is a serial, if someone's a Zach rogues gallery villain, then maybe there should be some type of system that is like, hey, just so you know, this, your counterparty in this, or your the person you're lending to in this has this track record, which I think is pretty much limited to, I mean, look how long it took people to figure out that Sifu was part of Wonderland, right? Like, there are definitely use cases for that.
Totally. And it's interesting to think about, because as soon as there is some sort of I don't want to say credentialism in like a negative connotation, but as soon as there's some sort of credentialism on chain, then there's actually, I've been thinking about this too, because you thought about this idea of like, where you said this idea of like spinning up a new wallet, right? It'll be really interesting to see if like there's some sort of like, I'm not even saying it like if there's some sort of market where people are literally going to be selling private keys, because basically identity and reputation accrues to the wallet. So I think obviously there's probably a ton of really, really smart people thinking about this idea. And I think there's things like identity accruing to a wallet, or an identity accruing to an NFT. I don't think I don't think I'm qualified enough to really think about like what these approaches are, but definitely a space that I'm just trying to learn about a lot more as well. Because I think I'm wondering if like the way to think about this is like, first there's DeFi, then there's NFTs. Obviously, I'm a bit biased. Then there's obviously kind of these crypto native internet organization with DAOs, and then maybe the next kind of wave within crypto is this idea of identity. And then I'm curious to hear what y'all think might be after identity, or even like what might be after what this current cycle looks like. But I think those are a few of the things that are just really interesting in as a whole.
I'm thinking back to one of the first terms you mentioned, what you called the identity stack. And immediately what comes to mind is some people talk about the idea of social capital or social credit. Immediately right there, you have a financial term, credit or capital, and you're tacking onto it an identity aspect with the word social, your personality, and or how people behave, your things like on-chain behavior. And immediately it's like, okay, two different pathways that I can think of. You have people relying on like their behavior, their good withstanding within a community. They're not solely evaluated based on their financial behavior. They're evaluated on who they are as a person. And then the other side is wait a minute, doesn't China have something like this? The Chinese, utopian social credit, like, yeah.
Although it is,
you can really go either way.
It is so funny every time someone brings up like the Chinese social credit system. I'm like, my brother in Christ, the U.S. has that. You can't get a house or like the idea of any state-run worthiness or I guess in the case of the U.S., like financial system run worthiness that in any way impacts your ability to like live a full and fruitful life is like, seems like inherently counter to crypto. But it is funny. I think we talk about the idea of like identity a lot on this podcast, and part of it is like how do you make that identity on the internet as real and valid as you do in like the one that you were assigned in real life. And I think part of that is, you know, having the ability to leverage your social capital, like V said, and crypto is a space that is almost exclusively based on that, right? Like, you know, there are many projects that, you know, like, I mean, an example is like I started working with Umami as an advisor because they wanted to move into like governance conversations, and I had written about governance, right? Like you find people are given like advisorships or brought into projects based on the strength of their like demonstrated social capital or their trustworthiness in the space. And I think that's, you know, that system is a lot healthier than one that like is like, well, sorry, you can't get a car or you can't get a house, right? Like anything that seems more designed to keep out like bad actors, I think is probably more viable for the long term. I mean, we're already seeing that, right? Like the Center Consortium announcing Verity a few months ago, which is pretty much like an identity verification tool for the purposes of like sanctions and anti-money laundering and whatever that is to like, you know, eliminate counterparty risk. So I think, you know, I think that's here and that's like where we're heading. And I think that is going to be like the next great schism in crypto is like people reacting to that. Although what's beyond that, I mean, I have no idea. We've said before, this is not a smart show. If we had the answers to that, then I would,
we probably wouldn't be doing this show.
Wouldn't be doing a podcast. V and I would be on our island that we own.
No, I love it. I love it. No, totally. I always love just brainstorming around these things, and it's kind of been awesome to think about. But I totally, I think there's so many interesting things. As soon as you talked about this idea of social capital, right? It's interesting to think about because part of it to an extent is captured on chain, and then the part of it is like captured off chain, right? Like I don't think there's an app that like, you know, puts your Twitter followers on chain, for example. But it's interesting to think about because as soon as you, and this is kind of going off like, or even like it might be completely random, but you know, I remember looking at some what was it, Degen Spartan's like tweet or someday, and it was he has really interesting thoughts, and it's really funny critiques of DAO governance, which in many cases and in most cases I agree with, right? Which is like, you know, if this person is the founder of a project and this person votes specifically for or against a specific proposal, it's interesting to see the kind of the trickle down effects of like, hey, when the founder of a project votes, what do the rest of maybe the token holders or people who really align with the way the founder thinks vote as well, right? And I think that type of social capital right now isn't necessarily captured on chain. It might be to an extent where you can say, hey, you know, because the founder of this project might get more tokens because there's, you know, a team allocation to a token allocation as a whole. But like, again, like it's just really interesting to think about when it comes down to that relationship. And I think, you know, if we ever want to talk about DAO governance, I think there's tons of really dope things to think about there. But, you know, those are some of the things that I have and thoughts there regarding like that balance between on and off chain for social capital in of itself.
For sure. And it's one of those, like, thinking broadly, you know, there's a distinct difference between, say, a fully transparent type of collateral is not the right term, a fully transparent type of system where everyone can look at on-chain activity and determine, you know, okay, I want to work with this individual, like individuals working with each other, versus what I think, Kitsune, you're kind of more opposed against, like a centralized entity kind of overseeing or controlling it all and then using that to determine who can do what, you know, in place of a government. But something else too is the fact that, you know, trying to make this work on a global scale, not only will you have to, you know, deal with various central entities, governments, you know, that, you know, potentially it's against their best interest to kind of integrate with this type of system. But even from a cultural standpoint, like coming up with a system that works literally for everyone, like everyone's going to have different interpretations, different perspectives, you know, just on a sheer scale, it's just a difficult problem to tackle.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's like, there's really good analogies. I think there's I forgot who it is, but feel I can send you kind of like the link or some of the thoughts there later. But like someone had this analogy of like blockchains being countries or cities, and when I kind of like put my own twist to that, I was thinking that blockchains are probably countries, and then DAOs are probably cities living on the blockchain. And I think that's the interesting thing here. If we believe in a multi-chain future, then there's obviously going to be different trade-offs between different blockchains, obviously, and then different ways to think about. And blockchains are almost going to be like I wonder if in 10 years, instead of saying, "Hey, I'm Canadian," it's like, "Hey, I identify with this blockchain," right? And it kind of sounds
Right.
weird and funny to say, but then when you say, "Hey, like so, like I came from Vancouver, Canada, right? So, or I might come from San Francisco, America, right?" And it's kind of interesting. So you're saying, "Hey, I'm from Ethereum," right? And that doesn't really make sense when I say it like this, but I'm from Ethereum, and then I'm part of this DAO, which relates to this city. And I don't know if I'm going anywhere with this analogy, by the way, but I'm
No,
just trying to think about that.
it makes a lot of. I mean, that's very Snow Crash and Diamond Age. That's like very much core old school sci-fi is the idea of like moving to a place of like decentralized economically based nation states that like that
Mm-hmm.
you choose to be a member of, which indicates like kind of a level of freedom. I feel like that doesn't exist in the modern world, but is like really aspirational for sure. I think one of the things about the future, the multi-chain future, is like whoever then figures out the real world building for those DAOs, like how do those DAOs enter the world in a more permanent and more tangible way. I think that's like the more interesting question to me,
Mm.
and I think that like really kind of goes hand in hand. Not to put too much of a bow on it, but that's like part of why Utopia service is valuable, like the idea of payroll, because like okay, a lot of DAOs are non-banks or don't have access to traditional rails of payment or traditional like fiat sources or even like these traditional tools that we take for granted, right? Like a business with a business banking account can manage payroll and lending
Right.
and line of credit and what have you, and use that bank account to acquire a bunch of things. And it's funny to think that like yeah, now being like, well, we're making payroll for DAOs or we're making lending business lines of credit for DAOs seems revolutionary, but it's actually just kind of catching up with the world as it exists in its current state.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a good point because it's like really like utopia to an extent right now. I think we have a much kind of more ambitious and larger vision over kind of a longer time horizon. But when you think about our product right now, it's relatively skeuomorphic, right? It's like, hey, we're bringing something that was already in Web 2 that we know is a specific pain point. Um, and we're bringing it to these new types of weird crypto native organizations that live completely on the internet, right? And it's not like this like genius level idea of like saying, hey, like this is like, this completely new paradigm shift. But the way we think about this is really just a way for us to, really learn with the market itself and this completely new kind of governance, mechanism. And I think for us, like that's like the way we want to think about building our company over the long term horizon, which is like, hey, if we're able to build something like this within the short term, it's going to make a ton of sense for a lot of our customers. We're going to basically be able to really provide actually a tangible value proposition. It's not super meta. You can touch the product today. We were able to ship a product within 2 months of us operating as a company. Like all of those things were ways that we kind of had these pros and cons. And I think for us, it's just like, what's actually going to replace our product in the next few years, right? Like those are the types of questions that we try to ask ourselves. And those are the products that we want to think of building. So I completely agree. And I think, there's really interesting ways. I think there's just two types of founders in cryptos, right? Like this is definitely not like the right terms, but there's like those gigabrain founders who come in with these ideas, probably from first principles, with these like types of new ways of completely doing things. And then there's really practical, and I'm not saying that these companies aren't practical, but then there's one side, like I'd say more like Utopia, where we're just very tactical, tangible, and it's already a product that people instantly get, right? Like it's something that, like, when we say payroll, it's not a word that we invented. So I think there's just tons of interesting things, and I think, to be frank with you, completely both approaches work. So it's just playing the long game, and I think that's, I guess, hopefully a good filtering, given the market right now, of who's really in it for the long run, right? And I think those are the questions worth asking. But yeah.
I guess, maybe to then zoom out to like more of a macro level, you were like, Utopia is not a DAO by any means, but, it exists on chain. Like, we've seen so many protocols that either operate to like various levels of decentralization, or autonomy. Like, is there a happy balance in your opinion of like, what is actually effective, right? Like, it's not
Mm,
probably terribly effective to have everybody in a completely flat hierarchy working in multiple time zones, kind of each toiling away at this one thing. And it's kind of counter the foundational principles of crypto to have like a super traditional hierarchical,
totally,
like vehicle, right? So,
totally.
how do you like see that kind of compromise between those two extremes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always think there's like, I think depending on the organization, there's different spectrums. But I think the relative analogy I usually think about it always comes down to like the city of nation states for some reason. Well, it's this idea that right now in most cases, right, DAOs are kind of these ideas of direct democracies, right, where everyone votes for a specific use case or a specific proposal, for all proposals that are literally out there. Um, it just makes a ton of sense for DAOs to eventually just become a degree of representative democracies where there's certain groups that represent certain interests. I actually saw a tweet from Maki yesterday that was really interesting, which was like, with sushi, what would have been optimal, and we can again link that in like the show notes because I don't want to butcher exactly what he said. But the thing that was interesting with the way he thinks about things is there's like these working groups and these sub DAOs that should actually have obviously a vested interest into providing value for the parent DAO and the entire organization as a whole. But then there should also almost be a vested incentive or interest for these specific sub DAOs in of themselves. So I think there's really interesting things to think about there when you think about this idea of incentive alignment, not only from just this parent DAO level, but also this idea of cutting up this parent DAO into specific working groups that then also have an incentive. Again, it relates to the parent DAO's mission and objectives and alignment there, but it also has its own incentive to ship product better, to be a team that can execute. So I think there's interesting things there, but that's the way I think about this in regards to this idea, the balance of decentralization and kind of this idea of autonomy. I'm really excited though, because it's just pretty obvious, how inefficient to an extent DAOs are today. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be as efficient as something like a C Corp or as a centralized company. Because in some senses, right, democracies are valuable because they might take longer than other types of governance frameworks. But eventually, we'd like to think that they make the right decisions at the end of the day, right, where they incorporate all stakeholders. And obviously, there's pros and cons to and flaws, and it's more of a theoretical thing. But I think those are some of the principles and things that we think about, and that I think about. Some of the DAOs that I think maybe a quick shout out to is like Gitcoin is someone that we learn a lot from. Big fan of the way they think about things. I love the fact that they have seasons. They have really great working groups. There's an element to standardization, but it's not completely, robotically process oriented to an extent, right? There's a lot of creativity and autonomy still. So that's my brain dump. I don't know if I even answered your question, but those are some of the thoughts that I kind of have around the DAO space right now and what we've seen.
No, I mean, there's like a lot of rich stuff there. There's a lot to dig into.
Yeah.
I actually have I was thinking about it, kind of a targeted question. You mentioned like you and or at least you, if not the team at Utopia, thinking about the next, what would be the next evolution or next step in terms of your product line, or like what products would replace certain products that you currently have right now. And I had to think back to the interview we did last week with Sammy from Redacted Cartel, talking about things like immutability and do we need things that have consistent upgrades instead of just having a product out there that's a solid standard. It doesn't need to be touched. It doesn't, perhaps like critical updates to fix bugs and things.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm curious about if you have any thoughts on that in terms of, and this is way too broad of like a term, but like payroll in general, or your current product offering, like, do you see it as a whole set of like products that need to be consistently updated, consistently tackled, or are there aspects of it that you're like, no, we have a solid offering. This is like, we're going to put it out there. It's ready to go. We don't need to touch it anymore. Maybe some minor tweaks and stuff, or even just your thoughts on the necessity of products to continue evolving in the space.
Yeah. that's that's also a really good question because like one thought that I immediately have, right, is like to an extent, smart contracts are much more scarier than what we're building, because really what we are is an interaction layer for you to interact with blockchain based systems, and what we utilize are things like Gnosis SDKs, for example, right? So there's really interesting things regarding this idea of immutability. I really think it's kind of context dependent on specifically DeFi primitives versus something like us, where we're more of a software alternative, where we run on like a Web2 stack, right, with a React and Next.js, TypeScript, all that type of stuff. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about. I think for us, no, I think for us it's just consistently like, hey, what is going to replace this specific payroll experience? Does it actually make sense in a crypto native internet organization for someone to pay, or a DAO to pay their core contributors once a month or biweekly? Like those are some of the questions I think about. I think maybe on a longer time horizon, the way we think about a product is not only like payments are just a byproduct of consensus. So really the thought is like, hey, once a decision is made, so once V and Kitsune and I say, hey, Kitsune should get paid this amount of Ethereum for basically being an advisor to Umami, or this amount of Umami for being an advisor, whatever that looks like. You know what I mean? So I think the interesting thing there is once the decision is made, and the decision is actually the thing that takes the most time in these types of decentralized organizations, executing the payment is not necessarily hard. And it doesn't take as long as the actual decision-making process, right? So the way we think about our product to an extent is that payments are just a byproduct of consensus. So what that simply means is that we're kind of expanding into this idea of how we can be this high level people and finance stack. Because I think, again, the interesting thing and the difference between a DAO and a C Corp, and there's probably a bunch of them, but like the oversimplification is that DAOs are interesting because to an extent there's liquid labor, and then to an extent there's liquid capital, right? And I think what's kind of ambitious about the way we think about our product is that we're trying to build software to manage these two things and coordinate these two things in kind of a transparent, efficient, and permissionless fashion. And I think that's a really, really fun thing to think about. So that immutability aspect, especially coming from our experience right now, just building and being in the space for around 9-10 months, actually operating Utopia, the amount of changes that we make to our product is it's quite a lot. And if you're a customer, for example, you probably do go through bugs, and those are things that we're trying to kind of really kind of work on as well. But it's just an essence of moving fast as well. And there's kind of a trade-off, and I'm sure you all know that with traditional software development too.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's funny that the concept of immutability really, in this specific case, kind of zooms out further. Like it asks a much more basic question, like what, about the nature of what is payroll, right? Like the idea of if you're constantly updating a DeFi protocol to be more and more secure, and then one day, get to put your hands up in the air and walk away and kind of let it live as this, as this self-operating piece of code on the internet, versus like the idea of, right, like, in many ways it's much simpler to make something like payroll. On the other hand, it's much more complicated to ask the question, like, why do we get paid like this? Or like, why do we get paid on these timelines? And, I think you've probably seen, in kind of the short to medium term, people with other ideas like, oh, it should be a constant drip of funds across every second of the day, or, oh, it should be like this, or, I think it comes down to like that tipping point in the space where these organizations have figured out, and I'm kind of like, despite thinking a lot about DAOs, I'm kind of like a DAO foe. Like I think that they're so fundamentally inefficient. And I think more people have figured that out. So they're like, okay, wait, this system that we made is not necessarily efficient, and so inefficient to a point that we're just getting lapped by even these trad companies. And then it's like, well, wait a minute. So we've got to build a new system for our organization. And then it's like, well, wait, do we have to build a new system that revolves around compensation? Like, do we have to change the very way that we think about compensation into a more nuanced way? Like those questions, I think, to me, it's always very difficult to arrive at the right answer, but I think crypto at least encourages us to ask the right questions. And like a great question is like, well, why do people get paid the way they get paid? Or to like the DAO point, like why do companies operate the way that companies have traditionally? And it's like, well, the answer is usually like, right, like patriarchal hierarchy that's designed around, incentivization and fear. And like, our solution to that, I think, was something really optimistic at the start, right? It's like, well, everybody is on this flat structure and we can all kind of self-direct and self-organize. And that ends up being, morally probably more righteous and upstanding, but efficiency wise, absolutely worse. So yeah, I think there is something to be said for like this idea of what replaces this. I think is a much more interesting question. It's like, okay, now what replaces the DAO? What replaces the payroll? What replaces the business bank account? I think Sammy said this in a really good way. Like the next generation will be more familiar with MetaMask than they are with traditional banking tools, and I think that's probably right. I think we are heading to a place where, I work in a pretty corporate setting that interfaces with crypto and with traditional rails, and it's like, the idea now as a very crypto native person that a payment takes 3 to 5 days to get to you is just absolutely bonkers and bananas and crazy and like unacceptable, and I think our rush to solve that is probably right, like the gold rush of crypto, and then that the more interesting questions come later.
You're totally right. Like I think it's interesting because I'm obviously biased with given like my context of experiences, but it's interesting because there is some gold here, right? Like the interesting thing here is that traditionally in C corps and LLCs and tradition, just big companies, right? Like there's been really antiquated workflows, whether it's accounting to budgeting to payroll, to a lot of these things, right? That all happen behind closed doors, right? Like it's not like it's not like the entire Microsoft organization determines the budget for the upcoming fiscal quarter or the fiscal year, right? But the interesting thing with DAOs is that it's completely flipped on the back of its head, and that's why I think Utopia is even alive as a company, which is the fact that there's these different and in really interesting workflows that are just completely built for a different type of organization that has different values and different ways of operating. And obviously, like the very first and easier thing to think is like, like why and like is it actually more efficient than the way we think about things, right? And the traditional alternative. And I think again, there's tons of interesting things regarding like if it actually is, and I think we can go down that rabbit hole for hours, but I think it's a really, really important experiment. And like you just said, it's a really important question to ask ourselves. And that's the beautiful thing too. I think the fun things to think about these really interesting things after this idea of understanding the most primitive use case of finality versus, traditional alternatives is where we're at today. So it's actually on, and I'm sure we all know this, but there's literally no better time to just be able to build in this space because of those reasons.
It's definitely fascinating just watching the space evolve and how entities change and how, be it organizational structures or various, all their different approaches. I've been thinking back to my my previous corporate job was working for an oil company in IT, and one of the things that we were working with an old like IBM software system from the 80s, heavily modified to suit our needs. And one of the things that stuck with me was we were going to migrate to a new system, and the company, the C-levels were like, okay, how do we want to approach this from a business perspective in terms of efficiency? Are we going to find software? Are we going to find software that we can customize to our needs, or are we going to customize our business to the software we pick? So it was just an interesting perspective from, we talked about like a flat organization, great from a moral perspective, but not necessarily from an efficiency perspective. And kind of the same thing with all of the different software tools and platforms that are out there, especially emerging in the crypto space. Like what, as you say, like being able to determine what's best for your needs, but are you going to, are DAOs or traditional businesses, are they going to adapt to the software or vice versa? Or there's a place for both. It's obviously going to be a gamble in terms of what's going to be the most efficient, because there's a lot to consider and factors that can't be predicted. But yeah.
No, I completely agree. It's interesting because it's like, okay, we actually kind of went through that product challenge ourselves very early on. to an extent, we want to, it's not like completely, standardizing things, but to an extent, we want to standardize, DAO operations for a lot of the DAOs that we work with. But the thing and the kind of insight that we learned pretty early on is that we can kind of give a base framework of how things could or should be done. And the way we kind of came to those kind of conclusions was, hey, we looked at how DAOs operate. We've been able to speak to a ton of them. So there's probably like a base framework of things in terms of how you can manage these things. But then what we later realized was that we could give the space framework. There's almost this idea of building an unopinionated kind of modular and extensible product that actually serves a lot more value for the DAOs in of themselves. And that's obviously why we have things like DeFi Lego blocks. And there's really, really interesting governance Lego blocks that are starting to kind of, go out there and build out there as well. So I think, no, I completely agree. The balance between standardization and building an unopinionated product is interesting because, we take a lot of inspiration from Web2 tools like Notion, for example, right? Notion is a pretty unopinionated product, right? You're able to embed things. You have a lot of creativity, but the ability to use Notion might take some time for a person to understand how to actually use it, right? And I think there's like a nice little trade-off there where there's almost a balance. And tools like Google Docs, like people instantly get it, right? But it's extremely standardized compared to a tool like Notion. So it's finding that right balance for us, especially like it's knowing that right now the right approach is actually building an unopinionated product. And one thing that we launched was this idea of custom metadata, which you're basically able to kind of attach any type of form field, whether it's a file to multi-select tags to date ranges associated with any on-chain payment. And that turned out to be really valuable because we've seen a ton of really interesting use cases, right? So I think there's a really, really fun balance when you think about that from even just a product development process, specifically in crypto.
And even that gets into like a potential continual flow of revenue stream instead of putting out a product and being done with it and potentially not earning or bringing in more, say, be it revenue or continual development of it, either offering like, educational services on how to use the product or more, as you say, more features, more, even types of modular like add-ons to continually keep it evolving and to keep the, from a business perspective, keep the business operating.
Yeah.
Totally. To think about.
It's so funny that you brought up Notion because I just saw a tweet earlier today where someone was like, I've stopped using Notion. And the reason was something kind of similar to like what a mentor of mine once said, which is like that any productivity tool where part of the quote unquote productivity becomes building out the productivity tool and maintaining it to such an extent is not actually a tool for productivity, right? Like, and I saw part of that same tweet, someone said, and I'm going to paraphrase, like that Notion is like a house, and somewhere in that house there is still a fridge that I have a to-do list on. You know what I mean? And I similarly, I built out like a bunch of things for like on Notion, both personally and professionally. And I think that is like the real issue. Like if we want to talk about, the business conforming to the tech or the tech conforming to the business, it's like if something requires like that level of not just like knowledge from its inception, but also the continual maintenance, you have to ask yourself, is it effective? Like I recently went back to literally just, I handwrite everything and I have a to-do list with 3 primary tasks and like 8 subtasks for a day. And that's it. That is all the personal like organization and productivity I used. And that's not obviously scalable for a company, but I think like if we want to get back to something like, the first principles conversation, like what are we actually doing here? Like at what point does the maintenance of this tool end up being more work than what the tool was supposed to solve? And like
if your job title is business Notion maintainer, is it a bullshit?
Is right? Could you explain your job to a medieval peasant? Right? You know what I mean? Like
Totally.
and like I personally really like Notion, and I think it's like a great solution for companies or projects that have that bandwidth. But I think like zooming out into like the overall tech, like there are so many parts of crypto still in standing in the way of adoption that require such a manual or educational lift to use, right? Like Utopia is very instructive, and I'm not using this to like shill your product, by the way. I legitimately think it's very good. But like there are so many aspects of crypto where it's still like the average person making it over that first non-intuitive hump is really difficult.
Yeah.
And then the idea of continuing, I mean, that's where like things like auto compounders or aggregate vaults or dashboards came from, right? Where you can instantly like the idea of like, oh, just a few years ago, basically, I would have to go to each of these things and collect rewards manually, and then I would have to restake those rewards, and I would forget about this protocol for a while, and I would have to go back and I would have to connect it to the different chain with a different wall. Like there is a level that problem gets solved by people being like, all right, we're just going to build something that compounds and collects and auto stakes, whatever. And like from that same thing, the missing element there, specifically with something like Notion, and I guess more broadly with business things, is like a lot of business tasks are, while they can be repetitive or similar, they're not necessarily identical to the space that like automation could take it over, right? Something like payroll is, right? Like that, one of Utopia's great things is like I basically forget about it for 2 weeks, and then I go and I click one button, and then someone gets paid. But like the idea of like trying to replicate, to V's point, like if you're a big company trying to like replicate these daily tasks, you have to use this weird tech stack that maybe you inherited, or you have to go through the arduous process of making your own.
Yeah, totally. No, tons of really good points there. I think I actually went back to the notebook as well, so that's kind of funny. It's kind of a funny pattern there where literally have a notebook beside me and I write down 1 to 3 goals that I want to get done this week. And I think it's just like less is more at the end of the day, right? And I think it comes down to not only just the internal processes that DAOs might have, but even just product development. Like it just seems like this principle and this theory should just be applied across every single vertical or just department, so to say, of a DAO or even just a DeFi primitive. So no, I think y'all nailed some really good points.
This is cycling back, but we talked about briefly like the economic power of DAOs and having like potential crypto nation states, and I've been saying this for a while, occasionally on Twitter at least, but I'm kind of, because I know we'll have like DAOs or entities that have the economic power of nation states, and I'm just like, when are we gonna have one that's gonna start buying fighter jets and tanks and literally like flex its economic power and move into a different subset of power as a nation state and literally potentially become a nation state, have that type of global power? I personally think it's inevitable. It's going to happen at some point. I'm just not sure what it will look like or when.
It's the meme of like who's going to buy the island, right? Like it's like which
exactly.
weird DAO is going to be like, you know what? Actually, it is more advantageous at this point for us to just establish our own tax haven, and our own micronation.
No, that's actually a really fun exercise to think about, because like DAOs, to an extent, this is not the only way we should think of them, but they might be serving as employment vehicles, right? And if you think of like even just companies as countries or just companies as nation states, right? I think, and I might again, it's easy to kind of look through this later, but there's like the like 5 biggest employers in the world are the U.S. military. I believe the Chinese military, and I believe number 3 or 4 is Walmart and Amazon, right? So there's interesting things to think about there, because if you think as companies as as nation states, and to an extent they kind of are, right? It's the real question is, when can a DAO either reach that type of velocity, or even if they have to, or have those types of functionalities within those types of organizations. So it's like, what does it mean for the rest of the world when a DAO does purchase? I'm not too familiar, but I think an F-18 is a type of plane, right? So it's just like,
yeah, sure,
So it's like okay, what does that mean in the world? Again, I haven't actually had enough time to think about those implications. Like right away, it's like, oh, this sounds kind of scary, but like, then we should also look at like how things are done today, and then you could also think, hey, this sounds kind of scary too,
Yeah, I mean, there's, the Amazon like union busting and surveillance state or like whatever, like there's a, Jenny Holzer quote, which is abuse of power comes as no surprise, which is like, of course, if somebody is, some entity is responsible for the lives of many people and has the economic or military might to back it up, then it's like, yeah, kind of all bets are off. What are you going to do? And I think that conversation, that dynamic does change when DAOs achieve that level of economic superiority, right? Of like all of a sudden you're not negotiating. I mean, it would be in many ways like close to like an alien encounter, right? Like you are no longer negotiating with like a traditional established entity that follows like the same set of rules as everybody else at the table, right? Like negotiating with an extremely powerful DAO would be so different from like a traditional company that's like dispatching its lawyers and is headquartered here and has these bylaws and these public members, where all of a sudden you're kind of dealing with this much more amorphous and quickly reactive collection of money. And I think that's I think the speed of execution, like we can talk about DAO's inefficiency and like day-to-day models, but I think in terms of like achieving consensus or getting things done, it's very easy for a company with a board of directors to make a decision, but then to like go through regulation and legal, et cetera, I think is a lot slower than a DAO arriving at a decision and being like, well, how do we operationalize this? Because they aren't bound by the same strictures.
At the same time, though,
just like, okay, if we want to like think of efficiency from a DAO, like if we want to compare this idea and this thought process of efficiency between a DAO and a company, then then it might make sense to say a company is more efficient in regards to decision making speed and execution potentially. But then when you look at the comparison between a DAO and a country, then it's it might be easier to say that DAOs are more efficient, right? And I think it's all about perspective, and it's all about this like it's also out of kind of breaking out of this analogous kind of like thought process that's really interesting to think about too. But I think like those comparisons are very easy, and I think maybe most people on Twitter just kind of have this analogy and this comparison between a company and a DAO, and I think maybe less people have the analogy between a country and a DAO and the thoughts between that, or even just a municipality, how cities are ran versus how DAOs are ran, or how countries are, whatever meta level you want to get down to, whatever, if it's federal or state or municipal, all that type of stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, you can already picture how that type of meeting will go, right? It's like you have like a head of state or a cabinet member meeting with a member of a DAO organization, and they talk and they're like, all right, well, try and implement X, and the cabinet member's like, all right, I have to go back to my cabinet and I have to, discuss, and then we have to like put it to a vote. And the DAO member's like, all right, I have to submit a proposal on chain, and then I have to get enough votes for quorum. And you can just picture that type of conversation.
Totally.
But I was just thinking this too, since we were talking about like the economic power of DAOs as potential nation states. I'm just like, some DAO is going to be like, let's buy the Cayman Islands and then implement make it a tax haven for other countries, but collect like a tiny percentage of revenue. Like just knowing people in DAOs and like economic structures, someone's going to be like, all right, how can we make a Ponzi out of this if we buy a country?
Yeah, the Ponzi-nomics and the even further off chain will be, I mean, it is funny that we live in a timeline where a DAO tried to buy a copy of the Constitution, right?
Yeah,
and like,
exactly.
That sounds like a joke if you had told someone like a few years ago. That would have sounded ridiculous. And now kind of in the present moment, it seems almost too small, right? It seems like that is such like a, that I mean, shit, we buy a Constitution every day. It doesn't matter. But yeah, like the next escalation of that, yeah, I mean, the game changes when a DAO gets a nuke, right? Like that's it. The first DAO to like find a nuclear weapon, then everything is different, and the world will change in like a very dramatic way. But yeah, I mean, I think in the short term, it's funny, just kind of pivoting back to what we were talking about in terms of product. It's like the DAOs that don't have product that are most interesting to me. Like DAOs that are genuinely a pure collectivization of individuals that are seeking like profit sharing or like collective action on like I don't know, like buying all of these NFTs and redistributing the process, like the proceeds from that. Like the builder DAOs make a lot of sense, right? That is, it's like a tech company, right? It's a lab, or this on-chain entity that has a public facing fund is no different than an investment vehicle. But it's those
Hmm.
DAOs that move with like the combination of like capitalist intent and like socialist utilitarian benefit for their members that I think are the ones
Mm.
that are going to be most interesting, right? Because it's there's a pretty clear trajectory of a DAO that builds a tech product to becoming a Microsoft, right? Like that makes sense. That's no different than
Mm.
someone building the computer in their garage. But it's the DAO that does not have that goal that is much more interesting to me, because that feels much truer to the nation state. Like we are banding together and sharing skill sets, not to sell a product, but to maximally extract value or to make large moves that exceed the size of our individual members for the benefit of everybody.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure there's tons of really qualified people talking about this as well. But like the initial thought that I kind of come down to is like right now, I'm based in San Francisco, and I think the for me, I was a person based in Vancouver, Canada. I wanted to be in San Francisco because to an extent it kind of aligned with my values, right? Like just this density of people who wanted to build awesome stuff and do some great things there. And I think obviously this idea of the aggregation or the conglomeration of the density of values are not necessarily happening in large labor market like cities like San Francisco, but rather actually happening on the internet, right? So I think again, it's just that simple thought of like, okay, there's much more to just selling software at the end of the day too, right? Like I think the thing that's interesting about the thing that you just said is that at the base primitive, what people are doing is they're aligning on values on the internet, and then things come out of that once there is like an alignment, right? Obviously, it's easy to be like, yo, let's start a DAO to build a product, but then it just comes down to this like these nuanced questions of why are you even building the product in the first place? And then if you actually have
For sure.
a relatively convincing answer or a relatively solid answer that aligns across the org, then that's when everything makes sense. So again, I think that's why like DAOs like Gitcoin are really interesting. Obviously, they do have a product, but they're just a great group of thinkers that, to an extent, all kind of. I don't want to kind of like kind of like say like stereotype them as one thing, but like this idea of alignment of values seems very strong in Gitcoin from my outside perspective, right? So there's tons of other DAOs that have this type of kind of mentality, which I really appreciate and love seeing.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of like that is the part that is most compelling to me is also figuring out like, well, in absence of a product, how do we generate value? And so I think a lot of people have, rightfully so, been like, we'll focus on a product thing. And then there are these elements of like these kind of populist, DAOs that are like, well, everybody get together, we're going to get in on these NFT mints and we're all going to make money. And not saying that one is like superior to the other, but I think they're both trying to like solve real world problems on the chain, just in like completely different ways, right? Like
Mm.
very rarely do people in real life get to align with each other in a way that is consistent with like their values, but that is also like economically like beneficial to them, right? Like the vast majority of people work in jobs that they don't particularly care for, with people that they don't necessarily share the same intrinsic value set or belief set or goal with, and then that's just it. And their only glimpse of that is their bowling league that they get to play in with their friends. So like I think there is like, if nothing else, like entities that exist on chain get to enjoy this kind of voluntary aspect of, yeah, hey, if you align with us, then like come on board and there will be something for you to do.
Totally, totally. Yeah, I think, yeah, I'm 100% with you there. I think there's again, I have no other point, but I think there's so many interesting things with the way we think about things and how DAOs literally just like I think another thing I talked about liquid labor, liquid capital. I think the thing that's also interesting about DAOs is just that how they originate on the internet before they originate in a nation state, and I think that's the creation aspect is what's really magical as well. If people had to meet up in person to then start a DAO, and I'm not saying like I'm saying that this probably did happen. This happened probably numerous of times, but that's not like a some sort of rule that you have to go through, right? Like people over the internet create DAOs and create companies, and that's how I met my co-founders. In fact, we incorporated in Delaware before we ever met each other in person, and now we all live together, or three of us live together actually. Another of our co-founders flies in, every other month, but it's a really dope setup, right? So I think that's like the beautiful thing about the internet as a whole, even abstracting crypto. Obviously, crypto just enhances that ability. Yeah.
I was trying to think, V, do we want to pivot to lightning round and fun question time, or did you have any other pressing gigabit brain takes?
Takes. I don't know that I had anything specifically pressing in mind, and I think we can pivot to lightning round questions if you're up for it, Kaito.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, these are very, there's very, I mean, I'm sure there is some nuance to these, but honestly, it's just like the questions that I would like to ask, like get to know somebody like at a bar, for lack of a better term. It's like, what's your favorite food?
Sushi. No question. Hands down.
Any particular, like just sushi as a whole, or are you like adamantly about one type of fish?
I'm pretty basic, man. I love salmon nigiri. That's like my thing. Anything with salmon is kind of like my go-to.
Nice. And salmon is one of those. It's like I found with people, it's like salmon because of its like unique, I will say, flavor. It's like you love it or you hate it. I haven't really found an in between for people I've talked to.
It's like the universal. I don't know. I feel like it's the people pleaser fish. Do you have a favorite? Do you drink? Do you have like a favorite cocktail, or do you like beer, wine?
Yeah, I don't drink often. It's more of like a social scenario that I drink in, but I started getting into like wine, and it's nothing fancy. I don't think it's just like, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing this right. I think it's Cabernet Sauvignon. Those are
That's
like
it.
a classic one. I like that sometimes, but yeah, not a super heavy drinker, but big fan of wine now. Starting to become a bigger fan.
I feel like there's a pretty even split on crypto Twitter. People are like, yeah, I don't really drink that much, and then people are like, I'm drunk right now.
No, I feel you too. Those are actually like, I'm pretty sure half of the shit posts that are on crypto Twitter are from those people, which is awesome.
Yeah, when you see someone gearing up for like a good, you can tell they're buzzing a little bit and they're on on the tweet storm. That's like my favorite thing. That is its own. Well, actually, I guess on that question, who is your favorite poster on Twitter.com? Like, who do you have notifications on? Who do you like? Who brightens your day?
Wow, that's actually a good. Wow. Let me just scroll through my Twitter feed real quick. I probably bust. I really like. This isn't as much shit posting as much as it is kind of like Gigabrain stuff. Don't get me wrong. I do like some shit posting here and there, but big fan of like Hasu. I'm sure that's a pretty obvious one that a lot of people like. Yeah, Hasu is probably the one. What was it? TZ Talk Chad. He's fun to think about and hear his shit too. So. I like a balance of both like Gigabrain stuff and then just being lighthearted.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta have those like clear genius answers because I mean, like mine, like the real answer would, is like somebody who's just like posting unhinged shit constantly. Do you have someone that you think is like underrated on Twitter that you're like, damn, we gotta pump this person? Like, like you feel like they're your secret gem of a tweeter.
Yeah, actually, I really like. If you're interested in like DAO contributors, DAO ops, I'm a big fan of like a lot of the Gitcoin contributors. So there's people like I just like learning from them. Really well, Austin Griffiths. He's one person at Gitcoin that and does some really dope work from like an eng technical side. There's Disruption Joe. He's a fun person to follow who talks a lot about governance, and I follow him a lot. Let me see. Tons, obviously, like people like I don't think he's underrated at all, but like Small Cap is really fun to listen to as well. Those are a few off the top of my head, but I'm sure I'm missing a ton, dude. Yeah.
What's like a weird hobby that you have that people wouldn't expect? Like what's something like that if you told somebody that this is like something you're into, they would be like, wait, what, really?
Okay. I don't know if this is super weird, but I started really getting into like saunas, and like that's actually a shout out to like
That
my
is so
co-founder.
cool.
It's like, dude, like my co-founder has been shilling like this idea of like, going to the gym, swimming, and then hitting the sauna, and like, shout out Alex. But yeah, no, I've just started getting into saunas, dude. It almost feels like I have to do it like 3, 4 times a week now. So,
Interesting.
yeah,
That's a based obsession. Like that is, keeping it Finnish style. I'm like very pro sauna. I fully co-sign this. Do you do like the traditional like steam ones, or have you ever done an infrared sauna?
is the infrared saunas like just the one with wood? Like,
It's the one with wood where they microwave you
oh
very
shit, no,
very
I,
slightly. It's just like rays that make it hot in your body.
no, I think I'm just the steam room. I'd love to try out the infrared one. So if you have a location, drop the pin.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that one is like very funny because you get to go in and be like, "Shh, there's no steam. This isn't anything." And then like 10 minutes in, you're like, I'm being cooked from the inside. Like, I hope this is good for my organs.
No, for sure, for sure. No, I haven't even looked into like the scientific like benefits behind saunas or steam rooms. Really, I don't know. They relieve a ton of stress. They're actually a dope experience.
It's
Not
good
gonna
to
lie.
sweat, it's just gotta be
Right.
like I convince myself all the time like this. I love going to like the Korean day spas where you just get to like check in and there's like food court and like all these different things and it's just like for some reason I'm so like only anecdotally like this is the only reason I am alive and healthy is like just like sweating for hours and in like a weird red ochre clay room.
No, totally, totally. Yeah, man, I gotta hit one of those up one day. I gotta
I'm
find
gonna
that.
I'm
I
gonna
gotta
I'm gonna
find
go to
that.
San Francisco solely to be like, so where are we going to the sauna?
Please do, please do. Yeah, I don't even know all the good ones here. I just started, so it's just like a fun, nice little thing for sure.
Sorry, I was taking a drink of water.
No, you're
Um,
good.
here's like a big one that we often get on crypto Twitter because it is so part of the culture. Do you have a favorite like anime of all time?
This is. I'm so sorry, but like, I almost feel like I'm doing my country a disservice. But I'm actually half Japanese, and people are like, "Yo, do you watch anime?" And I'm
And you're
like,
like, no.
"Fuck." I'm like, "Fuck." Like, this is no, I don't. Sadly, so um, dog, yeah, no, I don't actually, which really sucks. It's not even like what's crazy is like I never even tried watching. Like I didn't even give it a
You were just like,
chance.
never,
You
it's
know,
never for me. Now
like.
in retrospect, that question does appear massively cringe because I imagine you have been now imagining the amount of like Caucasian people
Yo,
coming up to you over your life and being like,
literally,
"Yo, you're
literally.
Japanese? Do you like anime?"
Yo, yes, yes. Then like I'm like fuck, like I feel like yeah, no, it's I get roasted half the time because like my co-founder actually all two of my co-founders both watch anime. So they're like super like chilling it, and then the first time they met me, they were just like, "What the hell, Kaito?" Yeah.
I apologize on behalf of
No, you're good. You're
Twitter.
you're chilling.
So
You're
we have a
chilling.
new Utopia Labs product in the pipeline, like an anime aggregator or something
Yeah,
for
we gotta. Yeah, we're gonna Web3 my anime list and make it more. And actually, it's
No, no.
incentivized. We're dropping a token. Shit, we shouldn't have said that. Delete.
Oh no.
V.
Well,
Cut this in post.
We'll cut it in post, yes.
We got a new product.
yo, you know what's crazy though? You know what's crazy is our co-founder was basically like he like if we basically did like this like Super Smash Bros like investment announcement when Coinbase invested in us, and I could drop the link in there, right? But I didn't even know the reference. Like my co-founder just did it because he's so deep into anime. Um, it's not even Super Smash Bros. It's something else. Which is let me just scroll through. I can't even find it.
It's pretty good not even being able to know the reference.
No, it's like yeah. This looks like a promo. No, it's not anime really, but this looks like a promo of new fighter in Super Smash. So, no, it's funny. It's really funny stuff.
Do you
Yeah.
not play video games either? Or are you not into you? I was gonna say if you're like
Dude,
not with the Smash reference,
no, no, no. I do play Smash and stuff. I do play video games here and there with the homies. But it wasn't like super deep either. Again, like dude, it's crazy. My co-founder, he was actually really nice at League. He was like extremely nice. So like the new hiring strategy that you have, and his friend was super good at League too. So the new hiring strategy that we have is we try to look through who's really good at League of Legends in North America, and then basically just try to find their GitHub if they have one. So that's kind of like
that's the FTX.
hiring strategy.
That's the Alameda strat for sure. What is it? There's that photo of SPF testifying before Congress, and someone zooms in on his hands, and it's in like perfect league position. It's like this man has literally never been in a meeting where he hasn't also been playing League.
No, that's funny as hell. Yeah. No, I actually think that, like, obviously, like, not to get all serious and stuff, but there's definitely an intersection and overlap between like people who were like nice with gaming versus crypto, and like that overlap is definitely something that we try to look out for.
I was gonna say, is it difficult being on crypto Twitter not watching anime? Because I feel like so much of it is people like, either people LARPing as a character or choosing it as their identity or dropping the memes in there. Like, do you see like a Naruto fist bump gif and you're like, what is this? What could this possibly mean?
Low key half the time, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, no, I still follow him because the other half, or if it's not that like I'm against any of the content, but the other half makes up for it, if you know what I'm saying.
And there's enough like crossover too. It's not not like it's like specifically tied like as you say, like a fist bump. It's like, okay, I get what's being conveyed here, even if I don't know the context.
Yeah. Hello, fellow kids.
Literally.
Yes. How do you do?
No, I don't feel like gay cats, It's not like it's like if I wanted to know about it, like I could, So like that's like the fun thing about
it. Do you have any like random plugs, shout outs, teasers, anything you wanna do there while you have this platform of whole dozens of people to share with?
Brief moment to chill, go for it.
No, not really. Honestly, I really appreciate y'all having me on. It's really dope just talking about a bunch of stuff. Like I really actually appreciate this podcast because in a good way, there's like no agenda to an extent, right? It's just like we just talk about what's on our minds. So
we're making that look deliberate.
I mean, like, no, literally, like, oftentimes it's like, all right, or one of us will be like, all right, I've got a guest. It's like I have no questions prepared. Let's scramble and think of something.
It's more organic that way because it'd be very easy just to be like, we've looked through your entire CV and we have these questions about these points in your life, and also, what do you think Bitcoin is going to do? And can you talk about the merge? And then like that's every other podcast, and that's also every episode of those podcasts. Like you listen to crypto podcasts, no shade, no shame, and where it's just people who are like, well, I think Bitcoin will be going to this number, and then the other person's like, I think it's going to this number, and I'm informed by this analysis. That it's like, who the fuck is listening to this? Like, who is
really?
Who is enjoying what type of NPC behavior is this?
I'm good. No, exactly. So no, nothing to shill though, man. Really appreciate y'all having me on. I'll be on Twitter. Maybe that's the only thing to shill. If you're a DAO, always happy to chat. Those are probably the two things I'd say.
Yeah, I will say my little testimonial here, even though I said it was going to shill. I really like the product. I like Utopia. So if you like need payroll or whatever comes next, like definitely check them out. And yeah, I appreciate you joining with us and being willing to go deep on like a bunch of, esoteric and far-reaching topics. I didn't think we would get to like nation states in this one, but that is kind of the beauty of a free-flowing conversation.
That's the fun of it. Like we approach these. It's like we have perhaps a general outline of like how we're going to approach, like the perhaps style of questions, and then we just kind of roll with it and see what happens.
Yeah. This is also our first morning recording, so I was like super convinced that I was just going to be like, well, I got nothing in the tank. I got nothing to say. Good luck.
That cup of coffee helps. That cup of coffee just like energized me, like midway. I don't know if like y'all noticed, but like I was taking sips throughout the podcast, and then just like things just started rolling. So again, appreciate y'all the time.
Of course. So thank you. As always, if you like the show, please like, subscribe, leave us a rating or a review. Tell your friends, tell your family, get your grandma listening to this podcast. And our usual plea here, V and I always want to talk to people and hear interesting stories. So if you have a story that you feel like sharing, we would love to be the vehicle for it, and we would love to get to know more about you.
And everyone has a story, so don't be afraid to reach out.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the very least, we'll wind up talking down some weird rabbit hole, and it will be fun regardless. So, yeah, please just reach out to us, and we will see you next time.
Thanks so much for listening.